David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, Elijah, thanks for having me back.
Definitely, and we love to always have you on. Your website, I forgot to mention, was themorganreport.com. Now, the first topic I'd like to discuss with you is we had you on previously in the year, and you were talking about it was a really good setup for silver, but what we saw during June, gold and silver both fell quite a bit. So what is your perspective on this, and are you still looking for silver to break above $20 this year?
Well, maybe not. I mean, I hate to be wishy-washy, but anyone that's wanting to forecast, any commodity or stock over, a year's time, it's rather difficult to do. I mean, the gold market was in a year-over-year uptrend for 11 straight years. So, I mean, those were the good old years. But since the peak in September 2011, it's been basically in a down to sideways trend. And silver has fared even worse percentage-wise. So I doubt we're going to see 20 this year, but I don't want to rule it out. The reason that I'm being a bit defensive is because there are so many things fundamentally that are positive to the metals that, and nothing can move like silver and soybeans. It's an old saying in the commodity sector, but it's true. Those markets can look dead for a very long time, and once they start on fire, they can really, really move. So will that happen? I doubt it, but could it happen? Yes, it could.
Now, what we've seen just, I believe, starting in May is a lot of dollar strength, probably caused a lot from the Fed, being very aggressive in their monetary policy, tightening a lot. What is your perspective on this? And do you think this is one of the reasons why we saw gold and silver crash?
Yes, I mean, they're inversely correlated. And so you see, dollar strong, gold weak. But really, gold's more negatively correlated to the stock market. And the stock market continues to ebb and flow and still looks strong. In fact, on my weekly perspective, I do on my podcast every week. Last Friday, I talked about, positive signs in the stock market. I took a deep breath. It's not necessarily what I expected, but that's the reality. So two things going, the dollar and the stock market. So really, in a way, and this may again sound a bit defensive, it's kind of surprising gold's doing as well as it is relative to how well the stock market is done and how well the dollar's doing. And back to the dollar, once we hit the 88 level, I really thought that we would see an acceleration of the downside in the dollar. And I couldn't have been more wrong. The dollar picked up from there, and now I don't know. I don't have my chart in front of me. I think it's at the 93 level or maybe higher than that. So, it's the way it is.
Now, one thing that might impact the demand for silver specifically is green energy. And you've reported on this. It was an article coming out of the Silver Institute. They said that 1.5 billion ounces of silver are projected to be used in green energy, including solar, battery electrical vehicles, and plug-in hybrids through 2030. So that's a lot. It's 1.5 billion ounces, which is around 15% of mine supplies over that time frame. So what is your perspective on this and how this will impact demand and the price?
Well, it impact demand, obviously, and of course that's a projection. So will the EV market, the electric vehicle market, go that strongly from now to 2030 is to be determined. But any market moves on the margin, which means that, the market could supply that increased demand to the industrial users without any strain. So where is the strain? The strain is that demand that's hard to meet, which is, the last bidder at the auction, the last person that bids on a stock. That's the last price that shows up on the tape the next day. Point being that it's monetary investment demand that's really going to move the silver and the gold market. Gold is almost all monetary demand. Silver, obviously, increasing industrial demand. So I think it will have an impact. And if we get a monetary demand on top of that increased industrial demand, that means you're going to have more, let's say, of a squeeze than you would have if it was primarily just industrial or just monetary demand. So the two actually act together in a bull market to force prices higher. And of course, in a real depression type of environment, then of course the industrial demand would slack off, could be considerably. But then that's a hard one to state because in a real downturn, 70% of the silver market comes out of lead, zinc, and copper mining, and 10% from gold. So if there was a really, let's say, a greater depression, it might not be as devastating as silver as people think, because you would have the majority of the producers, copper, lead, zinc mines, that were basically, not doing anything in the worst case scenario. So that would take a lot of supply out of the silver, out of the silver market. So on balance, it's good. I think that one thing that really isn't explored enough is silver's use as a battery. Probably could make the best battery out there. I've kind of been remiss in looking into that. The rumor when Buffett bought was there was going to be a silver battery. That was one of the many rumors, and of course that was just a rumor. But silver certainly, stores electricity very well, so it would be expensive, but it would also could be, and military actually uses silver-based batteries, not throughout the entire military, but in certain applications that's required to have absolute reliability and long-term, they use silver.
If we're seeing 1.5 billion ounces projected in the next 12 years, how big of a change is this really?
Depends on if we're going to hit peak silver or not. I mean, I'm pretty convinced we've hit peak gold. So any new demand that cannot be met easily is going to force the price higher. So if silver was in the same position as gold, where they're mining, at 1 gram per ton, then it would be very, very bullish. But we're not. I'm pretty convinced from my work that peak silver hasn't come yet. Now there's others that are notable in the silver industry and silver spokespeople that would probably argue with me, but I'll put my work up against anyone's. And just from a few of the properties that I've been to in Mexico, there's some significant deposits that have yet to be brought to the surface. So, again, it's monetary demand. I mean, it will have an impact. So what's the numbers? I think I did it in my head real quickly, but I think that would add like another 100 million ounces of silver per year to demand, with that 1.5 billion from now to 2030. See, that's 18, it's 20. It's roughly 12, 30, 10, 12 years. And so it's a little more than that. It's maybe 120 million ounces. So that's significant, especially if it started next year. I mean, that could be enough, next year, just that industrial demand to force the price higher. And then, of course, that would get investors excited, which would buy more because people love buying high-priced silver. They hate buying low-priced silver. So, and this is true. So that could have an impact, but this isn't going to take off with that kind of demand next year. It will, it'll ramp up. But it's the reason I did that update, Elijah, was to make the silver bugs aware of it, and also to basically not lose heart. But you don't want to bank your whole silver investment based on industrial demand. You want to think it through.
Right. And I know you've talked before about how, the state of the economy you're not so confident in. Is that still your view? And do you think, therefore, because it seems like if, this projection is probably assuming a pretty strong economy, this projection of demand for green energy, or demand for silver in the green energy industry. So do you think this projection is accurate if we're going to see some sort of an economic crisis in the future?
Well, Elijah, I don't know how long you've known me, but you know me for a number of years, and I'm a pretty outspoken person. I think it's a lot of hype. I do think the EV market will continue, but I think it's being pushed primarily by government. It's really not as green and as efficient as people say. I mean, if you look at Steve Rocco's work or Steve St. Angelo, I mean, you get a better picture because you want to look at it as energy return on energy invested. I mean, for every electric vehicle that's produced out there, how much oil do you need to get all those materials to the right place to produce an automobile and then put batteries in it? Another factor that really isn't talked about very much is these lithium batteries and how long they last and what happens at the end of maybe a 5-year cycle. If you got to put in a whole new battery bank and you got to put in another $15,000 into your EV, how efficient is that? I want to rant a little further, Elijah, so allow me. There was an article written by one of the people that works for, or works with, I guess, Lew Rockwell. Lew's one of my heroes. I don't say it in public that often, but the founder of the Mises Institute, really great thinker and a great human. A guy named Eric, I forget his last name, forgive me, Eric, but he wrote an article recently for the Mises Institute talking about what happened to the Volkswagen diesel. And for the records, people think that I'm biased, and I am. I own one. I didn't buy it for the green properties. I bought it for the efficiency and the fact that diesels live a long time. But in this article, Eric suggested that maybe this is more of a government push toward electric vehicles than might meet the eye. And that basically the diesel market has been crushed. And it gave a few pointers about EV versus diesel. For example, the car that I have gets a range, he said in the article, 700 miles. It gets over 600. And it takes you 5 minutes to fill it up. But for $15,000 to $20,000 more, you can buy an electric vehicle that gets a range of about 200 miles and has to be charged for 5 hours. So which is really the most efficient? And as far as miles per gallon, they're pretty comparable. So I'm for the free market. I mean, if the best thing out there is electric vehicles, so be it. The problem I have is if you look at Tesla, how much government subsidies have they had up until this point to get to where they're at? Well, tons. In a free market, that would be out of business because the market would say, the electric vehicle might be the most awesome thing ever invented, but the market's not supporting it. So the market would be voting no. Now, not no, meaning maybe not no forever, but no right now. Maybe the timing isn't correct. But no. If the government gets involved, then they can make anything happen more or less by their appropriations or their subsidies, which is the case. So I think the projections that I talked about from the Silver Institute are way overestimated compared to the reality. That's what I think.
So it's a large overestimate, you're saying?
I think I think the projection is way too optimistic. I don't see 1.5 billion ounces of silver used for the electric vehicle market by 2030. I think you could cut that in half and probably have still be a little bit optimistic.
Mm-hmm. Then I guess the demand for silver wouldn't be as much as they predict.
That's right. If I'm right, and I think I am for the reasons I just outlined, that wouldn't be as big an industrial demand. So let me stop you there for a minute and just go over this industrial demand. I just got off another interview, so people that listen to all my interviews will hear it twice. But, what is industrial demand in silver? Well, let's just look at modern times. Let's look at like 2003. The industrial demand for silver was 35% of the market. Let's look at the latest silver study, and what was the industrial demand for silver? 55% of the market. Okay? So in the last, 15 years, we've seen the demand go up from 35% of the total to 55% of the total. And what's more important is if you go to 2003 and look at mine supply in 2003, it's roughly 550 million ounces of silver. And last year it was 800 million ounces of silver. So you went from 35 to 55. At the same time, in that same time frame, silver supply increased dramatically from 550 to 800. So that shows you that the industrial demand for silver continues to go up regardless of what anyone tells you. Those are the facts. And this projection, maybe it's an underestimate. I don't know. I believe that that it's an overestimate, but time will tell.
But so then monetary demand for silver
is falling off a cliff.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're sitting in SD Bullion. I mean, I don't know specifically because I haven't spoken to any of the primaries there in a while, but I just got off the phone with one of the largest retailers in the country. I've known him for over 20 years. I knew his dad, and he says he's never seen it so bad. He said he's never had months where there were more sellers than buyers, and he's had several. He's the wholesale market's just dead. And this is not just this one particular person. I've heard it across the board because I talk to several of these guys and they call me. And I've known most of them again for, a decade or two or three. And the wholesale market, usually in a normal market, if you have a Gold Eagle, the dealer, the retail dealer will buy it for a spot, let's say. So gold's at $1,200, $1,250. You pay $1,250, and then when they sell it to the wholesaler, they'll get like $350 over spot. So they make a little bit of money on it. Now the dealers, the wholesalers, are buying it basically at spot. I mean, there's no margins in this market whatsoever, and that's very, very concerning because the dealers, the wholesalers, basically don't even want to buy anymore. I mean, they are. But, they're loaded to the gills with, stuff on the shelves that no one's buying. So there's no real investment demand for physical at this time. And I say no, I don't mean zero, and I don't mean absolute nothing. But it's a very, very weak market right now.
Now, going forward, though, do you see that increasing and why?
Oh, yeah. Well, as you know, I mean, you started Finance and Liberty, and I know I wasn't the only guy you listened to, but I think I had some influence on you, and that means that, I know you. I mean, you're not going to just take David Morgan's word for it. You're going to go out and you're going to look at everybody. You're going to look at the other argument, and you're going to make up your own mind. You're going to use some thought. But no, we've never been in a position in all of world history where we've had so much funny money floating around and so many derivatives. If you look at the Exter pyramid, and you can type that into Google and do some study, EXTER pyramid, and discover in a liquidity squeeze what it really looks like. And as Chris Duane does over and over and over again, he talks and he shows that upside down pyramid and how small silver is to the markets overall. And I might write a public domain article, Elijah. I haven't done it in a long time, and I'd probably title it What If? And the what if would be, what if silver was the only money? So think of all the things that we've produced just in the last decade. All the cars and homes and factories and buildings and, sports stadiums and everything, especially China. And if you had to pay for it in real money, if there's only, 2.5 billion ounces of silver, what would the value have to be to pay for that kind of a build out? And it would be astronomically large number. So, there was a time when silver was money. And, the gold silver ratio is something I don't talk about often. I get asked about it from time to time. But, the gold silver ratio stayed between, 10, or really 12 and 16 for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, never going above 16. But once it was demonetized, it did. And so the point is that when they were both the same function, gold was money and silver was money, that ratio was at 16 or lower. But now that it's just an industrial commodity, the ratio, of course, has been, very high. In fact, it's around 80 currently, which means relative to gold, I think it's undervalued, very undervalued. But its role isn't just money, and we all know that. But the what if article would be a what if it was. And it doesn't take a lot of people to say, not necessarily that it's money, but that it's a store of value or it's protection against economic uncertainty or government default. And that's where we're at this time, Elijah. I mean, what would move it? Government default. I mean, we had bank defaults that the government bailed out. But the next default will not be bank default, it will be government default. And who's going to bail them out? Well, maybe a super government. And what's a super government? Well, it's what Jim Rickards alludes to with the SDR. It's a conglomeration of nation states that pull together and say, okay, here's the global currency. It's called special drawing right, and that's going to be it. But you have to sell that to the public. And if you have a country default, it might be difficult to sell another bunch of countries and say, oh, trust us this time. So I don't know, but we are in uncharted waters, probably the best fundamental time to be in the metals, and no one cares. Classic human behavior.
All right. Well, David Morgan, thank you so much for joining us today. Very exciting times ahead, it seems like.